Well, to our cost of living Q&A now, and we can bring in our contributors, Gemma Godfrey, a personal finance expert, and Dr Jeevun Sandher, an economist from King's College London. Very good evening to you both. Thanks so much for joining us on a fascinating topic, sadly not an upbeat one, but a very important one nonetheless. And we wanted to just dive straight into it and ask the first question, which we got from a viewer, Fraser, saying, will I be cut off if I can't pay my energy bills? And Gemma, maybe I'll put that one to you in terms of what the normal course of action is when someone is in a position where they can't actually pay the bill in the short term.
Well, that's usually the last step that's taken, so to try and protect people, because obviously energy is an essential need. But obviously with the rise of the Don't Pay campaign, this is a rising risk for many people. And the risk is, number one, if people are deciding to just cancel a direct debit, is there could be fees if you cancel. Secondly, you might be charged more if you come off of a direct debit, because usually that's one of the cheapest ways to pay. If you build up arrears, that's another risk. And it means that you can be moved onto a prepay meter, which also could be more expensive. So there is a risk of being cut off. There's also a risk that if you fail to pay an energy bill, it might affect your credit score. But at the same time, energy companies are under an obligation to try and find a payment plan that might be affordable. So speaking up early and speaking to them might allow them to review payments, reduce payments, give you more time, give access to a hardship fund, advice, and also support if you're more vulnerable as well.
And Gemma, do just remind us what benefits have already been announced from either the government or energy firms in order to help people, even though we know clearly they're small relative to the price increases that people are facing.
Absolutely. I mean, the main one was the £400. It started off as a loan, more like, but actually there's a £400 payment that's due in October. Obviously, the government's under pressure to increase that. There's also a lot around the warm home discount as well. So for pensioners, they could get up to £300. And again, that's been topped up as well to try and help the most vulnerable. But really, that isn't touching the sides, because when we saw before, we saw energy prices, a small increase, whereas now what we're looking to face is by January, energy bills are set to amount to what people earn on average. It's 2 months worth of salary just on the energy bill alone. So none of the benefits we've heard of so far are really going to be able to help people who are going to struggle to both heat their homes and also feed their families.
And wanted to get on to our next viewer question, which comes from Michelle. The question being, how long does it take for fluctuating oil and gas prices to be reflected at the pump? And Jeevun, I guess we have seen in the commodity markets the price of things like oil come off the peak. Does that take forever to filter through? Does it ever filter through?
Yeah, it's the old rocket and feather problem, where actually oil prices, when they go up at the pump very quickly. And when they come down, kind of petrol pumps are slower to bring them down. Certainly, there does seem to be some evidence of that happening. I would also say that how weak or strong the pound is does have an effect on how much kind of petrol at the pump does cost. And in terms of gas prices and natural gas and other energy prices, that's really being updated with the energy price caps. That was previously twice a year. It'll now happen kind of 4 times in a year. And unfortunately, on that side, of course, not any kind of good news, of course. We expect that energy price cap to be over £4,200. That's over a £2,000 increase come January.
And Jeevun, I mean, interestingly, oil prices still very high, have come off a bit. Gas prices have hardly pulled back much, whether we're looking at commodity markets or end-user electricity prices. And the UK, when it comes to electricity, predominantly gets that through gas. Is that right?
Yeah, 40% of our energy is from gas and the 40% from renewables. So certainly we are very heavily dependent upon natural gas and natural gas prices for how we kind of generate our own energy. That's why one of the reasons we've been so exposed to this latest increase. And it's one of the reasons why actually when it comes to our energy production and consumption, we need to start looking at more renewables and more ways to get to net zero. This isn't just about saving the planet tomorrow, it's about lower bills today.
On to the next question, which comes from Dan. What help is being offered to businesses to help deal with rising costs? And I guess it's fair to say, Gemma, we regularly talk about what is or isn't being done to help individuals, but small businesses in particular facing the same scale of issues.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the biggest looming problems that's just not being talked about enough. Because if you think about it, 3 out of every 5 jobs in the UK is provided by a small business. And there is no support out there at all. There's no price cap on the energy that they pay. There's no rebate. There's no payments that they're going to have. And the big risk is they'll have to pass on their higher energy costs to consumers, which means they're no longer competitive. And it means that a lot are going to be going out of business. If we look at pubs, for example, a quarter of pubs, research has just shown, a fear that they could either close within 12 months or the majority or most of them are considering redundancies. So the big problem, we talk about small businesses, but small businesses means problems with jobs. And look, there are calls to increase the threshold for business rates. There's calls for support to make them more energy efficient. But ultimately, again, in terms of what businesses can do, again, going to suppliers, trying to ask for help. But really, there is not enough support out there from government. And a lot of them are at the brink because they still haven't bounced back yet. And they still have loans to repay as well.
And Jeevun, the sort of multiplier effect to the downside of businesses struggling is even worse.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why we're expecting kind of these energy price increases. They're not just leading to higher inflation, higher prices for us as consumers. They also start to drag down on economic production and economic consumption as well. It's less money in families' pockets to spend down at the shop or indeed at the pub. And of course, pubs themselves having to put up prices to reflect their higher energy cost as well. It's one of the reasons we're looking at kind of 5 quarters at least of a recession coming forward. What the Bank of England thinks where we are today, that would be one of the most damaging recessions in the modern economic kind of era. And that's one of the reasons why actually we do need the government to get down energy prices. Yes, it does help consumers, but also should probably and hopefully help us get through the next era and get growth going as well.
Mick has the next question for us, Jeevun, and it's when the price cap goes up, what will happen to the profits for energy companies?
So for energy suppliers like British Gas and Centrica, actually the kind of energy price cap should be reflective of the wholesale costs. If the energy price cap does reflect that kind of properly, it should lead to huge kind of increase in profits. Although we have now seen that as kind of other people are leaving the market, we are starting to see kind of bigger profits on that side. And on the other side, if you like, what does the energy price cap reflect? Well, it reflects kind of wholesale prices for oil as well as natural gas. And as those prices are increasing, kind of those producers are seeing huge supernormal profits. Of course, BP and Shell posting profits in the billions. And that's why actually at this point in time, a windfall tax to take away some of that profit, which you should remember wasn't gained through innovation or any kind of, brilliant stroke of genius on their part, but if you like, a luck on those part of those companies should have to be taxed and put some of that money back into households' pockets and use that to freeze the energy price cap at where it is at the moment.
Of course, at the same time, those companies are selling their product globally. It's not just profiteering domestically. And as recently as 2020, we're facing the opposite of very low prices. So it does come in and around. But my question with that in mind, Gemma, is whether one will ultimately hurt the prospects of the UK economy medium to long term if you try and hit these companies too hard in the short term.
Absolutely, because again, we come back to that point that companies are employers. They're the ones that, we rely on companies to give us jobs, to help with income and things like that as well. So one of the biggest risks when we talk about trying to avoid recession, which obviously is inevitable now, is to try and support companies to help grow out of it. And one of the biggest risks that we face is that if we don't support, we need to support households, but we also need to support companies because, again, one of the reasons why we're in, again, such a frantic position when it comes to consumer energy prices is because 30 suppliers went bust since the start of 2021. So there's less choice, so you can't shop around. And that's just in the energy sector. So again, if we don't support companies across the board, and we're talking about local companies that try and remain competitive, that try and help service people's needs, then you're left with, much larger companies that have more monopolies. And again, that pushes prices up for everybody. So, it is a real time to kind of band together and try and help support local businesses.
And just to dwell on this point, one more, Jeevun, which is there a benefit to having a global oil and gas company, which clearly sells its product, the most commoditized products by definition in the world, all around the world, to have them headquartered here in the UK? Is there a benefit from the tax take for the exchequer? And does that have to be considered before crazy windfall taxes or bigger windfall taxes is what I mean are imposed?
Well, look, we do now have a global corporation tax or a global minimum corporation tax that should help ensure that it doesn't matter where a company says it's operations are located, it's where they're actually located that the tax will be levied. And of course, those in the North Sea, they are physically within the United Kingdom. So there is a way very quickly to say, actually, yes, we'll be taking some of those profits, some of those extra cash. And certainly, look, now is the right time to do so. Luckily, we've got agreements across the world to try and stop profit shifting as well. So there is movement on that side. Certainly, you can't move an oil field. Oil fields are where they are. So if you tax them, I wouldn't worry about them shipping that North Sea oil over to Bermuda.
Fair enough. Our next question, Gemma, comes from Bailey. I'm currently a sole occupant on a prepayment meter. Should I switch to a smart meter?
I mean, this is a really good question because there are lots of people at the moment that are really struggling with prepayment meters because it allows people to pay small amounts more often, but it also means that they're often more expensive and there are fewer tariff options. Another thing to consider is the fact that there's a daily fee for being connected that people have to pay even when they're out of credit and even when they're not using electricity, but it'll be charged for them when they start to put credit back in there. And obviously the third risk is the risk of running out of credit and then obviously not having any electricity at all. Oh, and actually the fourth one as well is the inconvenience of having to go and top up credit as well. And I think all these things need to be considered, whereas smart meters can more accurately measure how much energy that you use to try and avoid overpaying. But look, there's lots of considerations here, and this isn't a personal recommendation, but those are, I think, some general points to consider when trying to choose.
Jeevun, we end part one of this hour of special questions on the cost of living crisis with a really simple one for you, which comes from a viewer. What needs to happen to fix the crisis?
Well, look, this isn't just a crisis we're facing, it's catastrophe. Okay, energy bills are set to go up by over £2,000. That's going to send middle-class families to the wall. It's going to send even more people on low incomes into destitution and to starvation. It's very clear in the first instance, freeze those energy bills where they're at now, freeze the energy price cap and use in part windfall and wealth taxes to fund that. Secondly, I'd say actually also increase public sector pay, which has lagged behind for over a decade. And thirdly, increase universal and pension credit to get more money into the pockets of low-income families. We did not come into this crisis in a great shape. 2.6 million children are already going hungry. It's clear they need more help, but also middle-class families as well. So freeze that energy price cap and get more money into families' pockets.
Jeevun, Gemma, don't go anywhere. We've got much more of this cost of living special to come, and we'll talk about your savings and your pensions and how much of it is protected next. Stay with us on Sky News Tonight.
Breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back to Sky News tonight in our cost of living crisis special with Gemma and Jeevun. Let's get straight back into it. As we said, we'll be talking about people's savings and pensions in this segment. And Gemma, the first question from Tammy: I'm due to retire and the crisis has slashed my pension. How do I get by?
And I think this is such a tough question because, as we know, pensions are one of the most tax efficient ways to save for your future. They're also, when employers are also contributing as well, that's free money. So it's such a shame when, pensions kind of get a bad rep because obviously, financial markets have fallen. What's really important to know and the lessons to learn from a situation like this is pensions should be de-risked as people approach retirement. So, it sounds like in this scenario that didn't happen because what should happen is that, people's pensions should move from being very much invested in the stock market to moving to safer assets like bonds or more cash-like as you approach the time in which you're going to need the money. So in a situation like this, obviously losses only get crystallized when the money actually gets taken out. Now, of course, I don't know the financial situation of Tammy, but the longer the money can be invested, the more likely it is that it might recover in value. But I also appreciate that during a cost of living crisis, that might not be an option. But, in an ideal situation, trying to keep the money invested for as long as possible and reduce the amount that you take out, especially with only 25% of it being allowed out tax-free, would be, maybe a sensible move.
In terms of, Jeevun, more broadly, how people should be invested right now, we're asked by another viewer whether inflation that's out there is a good thing or a bad thing for equities, for stocks and shares.
So inflation is reducing future cash flows. So unfortunately, inflation is not going to help you. It looks like help earn more money on your returns or indeed on your stock market portfolio. And to a broader extent, the stock market should reflect, appreciate quantitative easing has had a bit of a different role over the past decade, but should reflect kind of what the earnings of companies are. And that in itself should be determined by economic growth. So when you're entering very difficult economic times, you're reducing the cash flows of companies. That's also reducing the value of your assets today. So the real thing is actually you get the economy growing and then hopefully kind of get stock markets rising. That would include, of course, the values of pensions and other investments as well.
And that said, Gemma, for people looking, the very long term, if they don't have to tap this money for a while, inflation that is out there also erodes the value of cash.
Exactly. I mean, in a situation like this, what is guaranteed is that your money is going to be worth less in the future because as costs rise, your money doesn't go as far. And obviously, interest rates are still at historic lows. So the rates in which you're getting on your savings isn't going to give you what you need and isn't going to keep up, especially when wages aren't outstripping inflation as well. So absolutely. For people that are younger, that have much more time to invest for at least 3 to 5 years or longer, investing in the stock market. I mean, we're hearing obviously, the shares of energy companies that are able to profit from higher the value of energy there as well seem to be doing quite well as well. But if they have more longer term to be able to invest their money, then you can ride the waves because obviously you will see dips along the way, but being able to stay invested for longer, it is one of the few opportunities that you get to be able to try and beat the rising cost of living when cash absolutely is eroding over time.
Gemma, Jason asks, is now the right time to release equity on my house?
I mean, so this is quite a tricky one. So if we just look at the reasons why it's a good idea and why the reasons it isn't. So obviously, if you release equity, you're releasing a lump sum or income in return for some of the value of your home. But it's quite difficult to obviously advise in terms of, the reason why and the financial situation of the person. But we're actually seeing a rise in people going for equity release because with the cost of living crisis, people want to support their children. And so it has increased because people are looking to take cash out of their property and try and gift it to their children who are really struggling. So it is helpful for people that are asset rich, but cash poor. And now the products that are available have come on quite a long way. So there are penalty-free ways to partially repay it when you've obviously taken the money out. And there are competitive interest rates that are still at historic lows. But obviously the big challenge of this to keep in mind is you don't get the full value of your house. You don't get the value that you would do, obviously, if you're going to sell it on the open market. And obviously might affect inheritance as well, which might be the reason you were doing it in the first place.
Oh, just quickly on that note, Jeevun, because we did see house price data suggest a massive increase year over year in the last month's data, which feels a bit odd at the moment. What are we looking at in terms of mortgage rates and interest rates? Interest rates from the Bank of England have gone up, but where do they stand in a long-term perspective, and where do mortgage rates stand?
Yeah, so interest rates are, kind of beginning to rise again. And actually the market seems there's going to be further interest rate rises coming down the road. So it does look like actually those people who do have mortgages, if they're on a variable rate mortgage, it is going to get more expensive. And of course, over the past decade, kind of interest rates at basically around 0%. So the kind of financing cost on that side is going to get a lot more expensive. On the other side as well, look, we saw house prices increase massively during the pandemic. People both had a lot of savings at home that were sitting kind of not doing anything. They were spending a lot less money. And there was a huge amount of kind of printing of money as well that kind of fueled asset prices. So we saw a lot of that money being chucked into housing. It now looks like we actually might have hit the peak of the housing market. It looks like there might be a turn in house prices. I don't want to be too confident in asserting that, but it does seem to see that actually seems so unaffordable that people can no longer afford to get in there. And as the cost of living rises, people are more wary kind of investing in housing as well.
And then a final one on this savings and pension segment, Gemma. Can you explain the limitations of the £83,000 of protected savings?
Okay, so there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is I think it's £85,000. There's an extra £2,000 that's protected. The bad news is the trick here is to focus on where the money is. So what it is it's a compensation scheme that says that if the institution that you save your money with, so your bank or building society, goes bust, up to £85,000 per person per financial institution is protected. But the risk that people face is that it's per FCA regulated institution, and some institutions are actually linked. So HSBC and First Direct, for example, are linked. So watch out to see which institution is linked, because you can have different accounts across different institutions, and each one will be covered up to that limit. But institutions that are linked, you'll only be covered for £85,000 in total across all of those accounts.
Gemma and Jeevun, stay with us. Loving this cost of living crisis special Q&A. Much more of it to come here on Sky News, and we'll be talking about exactly what the government is doing and what more it could do, including whether prices will ever return to pre-COVID levels in the next segment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Gemma Godfrey and Dr Jeevun Sandher are here with me to discuss the cost of living crisis. We're on to part 3 and talking about government action. And Jeevun, the first question we've got on this topic, which more than one person sent in, is why the government is waiting for a new Prime Minister to come in to take the next steps of its action.
Yeah, it's a great question. And why did the Conservative Party take a whole summer to get here? I think it took them 13 days to replace Margaret Thatcher in 1990. And certainly the country was not facing the economic crises we are facing today. It's completely remiss the Conservative Party takes so long to appoint a new Prime Minister. Now, it is true, certainly, that as things stand, Boris Johnson doesn't have the mandate to carry out any kind of policies. That is for his kind of successor. You know, at this point in time, the cabinet wouldn't approve it, and it's not clear that actually there's kind of a way for them to do so. But actually, they need to have a new Prime Minister in place, and whoever that person is, they have to have a plan really ready to go on day one. But it's very remiss of the 1922 committee. You know, this is nothing new. We knew this was going to happen. We knew as soon as Boris Johnson left that these economic crises were coming down the way. We knew the energy price cap was going to increase. We thought there'd be a possible summer of discontent as well. We also know that actually our relationship with our closest trading partner hasn't been sorted out. We need someone to actually get Brexit done. It was a complete abdication of responsibility, and actually they should have shortened the timetable.
Perhaps at the margin, albeit different leadership rules for the re-election process than existed in Margaret Thatcher's day, which I think is the main reason for the gap then. Either way, Gemma, in terms of what people are facing on their energy bills, the next increase, while announced fairly soon, doesn't come through to October. So the new Prime Minister could then take actions to reverse it if necessary in the month of September, roughly speaking.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And clear, decisive action is going to be needed pretty quickly, because what we've also seen is that the energy price cap is going to be increased not every 6 months, but every 3 months now. And it's going to be increasing again, not very gradually over those 3 months. It's going to be increasing very, very quickly and in a huge way as well. So there absolutely is an opportunity to come in and do something, because again, if you think about that first payment people are going to receive, that £400, that comes in October, and there's a huge amount of pressure either for a price cap freeze or for that to be increased substantially to try and help families, because we are looking at an incredibly bleak winter. And we know that's coming, so that we know that there's action that's going to be needed, and decisive and very quick action as well.
Jeevun, in terms of what the action's likely to be, Neil asks, why is the political focus on rebates instead of nationalising energy companies?
So the main driver behind kind of rising energy prices at home is because global energy prices are increasing. You know, the oil price is twice as high as it was in early 2021. Natural gas is up by 5 times. And that's the main reason why our bills at home are increasing. And so if you nationalize companies, actually, it doesn't change the fact that global energy prices are increasing. You still need to find a way to fund those bills to be lower for families at home. And in part, yes, you can use windfall taxes and should use them on oil and gas producers who are making huge profits. But you also need to find a way to pay down, or rather reduce bills directly for consumers. That's why we are proposing and supporting an energy price cap freeze. It's the right thing for the government to do. There is certainly a costed way to do so. You know, nationalizing energy companies won't necessarily lead to what you need to have, which is lower bills for consumers at home.
Gemma, in terms of what the repercussions are of nationalisations, is it thought to be sensible? Not because there is also a point that if you look at certain industry, energy is one of them, trains another one, they are private but with a lot of government support. It's not like they're purely private in the first place.
And one of the big things that obviously we're talking about quite a lot today is the volatility in the price as well. You know, for consumers, for people to budget, people usually budget annually. You know, people aren't used to budgeting and changing their budgets so regularly, or having the ability. You know, people are hardworking families, can't sit down and readjust their budgets, you know, every 3 months. So, and when we're talking about supporting energy companies, absolutely, to try and help smooth that out, there's a lot of talk around that as well. So it does obviously lend itself to talk about how much more support we can give to families and how we can kind of link that as well. But I think it's, you know, it's a very, very tough time if you think about it for families, because, you know, a lot of people have only lived in an era where costs haven't really risen and interest rates have been low, and now they're fighting on all fronts as well. So, you know, energy companies do need to provide support. As I said, 30 suppliers went bust since the start of 2021. So getting more competition back in the marketplace, and again, that windfall tax saying, well, we're going to give you we'll tax you, but we'll give you the money back if you then invest it in renewable energy, or you invest it in longer term, more sustainable energy sources and solutions. I think more needs to be done there as well, because like progressing our agenda towards more energy independence and more resilient sources is the thing that's going to be needed to try and stop these shocks to consumers and to families.
Gemma, Jonathan asks, are prices likely to ever come back to pre-COVID levels? Now that the inflation genie's out of the bottle, is it hard to put it back in?
I mean, we see fluctuations all the time. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Prices go up, prices go down. What it comes down to, because in this scenario, everything's being driven by higher energy prices. Food is because of higher energy prices, etc. So in order for us to see prices come down, we need to have an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As I said, longer term energy independence, more competition back in the marketplace in terms of suppliers. And obviously this has come at a perfect storm. We were coming out of COVID as well. And also Brexit, having that adjustment as well to make sure that we've got better supplies, that raw material prices also come down in terms of those issues, and also that we have greater access to talent so that wages can also be controlled as well. All those things are going to be needed to bring prices back down. And at the moment, we're dealing with a perfect storm in terms of a fight on all different fronts.
Jeevun, I mean, the other cause for the inflation, of course, has been loose policy, whether we talk about it through the pandemic or for the last decade. So do we also need to see interest rates go up quite aggressively from the Bank of England, or is that counterproductive?
I think we've seen the Bank of England has taken quite aggressive action and sent a clear signal to the market as well as people at home that actually they are going to do what it takes to get control of inflation. We're also starting to see them they printed lots of money over the past during the pandemic. They're now starting to, in essence, take that money back and burn it. So the Bank of England now is in quite an aggressive path and has sent a clear signal about what they need, or their actions to reduce inflation in the future. I think on the flip side now, it's actually for the government to both put money into people's pockets, as well as when it comes to energy prices, directly reduce inflation as well.
On the question, Jeevun, of how much the government should be spending to help us, regardless of exactly how they spend it, I mean, where does our national debt stand today? Have they got room to borrow more to spend in the short term?
So certainly, look, our debt to GDP ratio is about 100%, which means our loan to income ratio as a country is about 1. And to put that into context, your viewers at home, when they bought houses, their loan to income ratio was 3 to 1. Now, most of us as individuals, unfortunately, we all die. So we have to pay down our debts to 0. Governments don't face that problem. So the United Kingdom is very far away from any borrowing constraint, if you like. They absolutely can borrow more money. But the question is, what are you borrowing that money for? And is the rate of return higher than indeed the rate of borrowing or the cost of borrowing that you face? At this point in time, first and foremost, look, if you're going to fund lower energy bills, there are great ways to go and get that money, tax it from those not only windfall taxes, but huge increase in wealth that we've seen, over I think 100 billion for billionaires in this country. But if you're going to borrow to invest, also borrow to invest to get a return. And in many cases, not just getting to net zero, but also insulating our homes. That's something that lowers costs for the future. It has a clear return. It doesn't just accrue to every generation in the future or the next 10 or 20 years in terms of lower bills, but every generation to come in terms of a planet that doesn't burn. It's a really good case to borrow to get to net zero, and absolutely the government should be doing that.
And Gemma, I guess if the government's borrowing in the short term and it prevents a more prolonged and painful recession, they'll, in one essence, be saving themselves money down the line.
This was the argument for why during the pandemic the government came out and implemented furlough and was making sure that actually people could get across that whole gap in terms of their income and their spending, because the big risk was, again, if people are losing their jobs, they're no longer spending, companies no longer are selling their goods, companies then lay off more people, and you have that horrendous vicious circle of things getting worse and worse. And the same thing obviously applies in terms of getting over the crisis that we're currently facing, to make sure sure that people are protected. But also, I think this is even more extreme, because this is a humanitarian crisis as well, where people coming towards a bleak winter, people are going to die. People aren't going to be able to keep themselves warm. We're already hearing stories about people, riding a bus just to try and stay warm when things were cold outside. So the government's under even more pressure, because again, you've got the NHS that's already quite strained, and as we approach the winter, that could get even worse. So this is absolutely one of these incredibly tough times with the government dipping into, and again, it's our taxpayers' money, but in order to help keep the country as resilient as possible, enabling people to get over and stop falling into debt is one of the main priorities. Because actually, talking about debt, the biggest crisis there is the more people fall into debt, the higher the interest payments on that debt becomes, and it becomes almost impossible for people to then get out of it, and it becomes even more costly then to try and save households at that point as well.
Jeevun, what's the outlook of continental Europe?
So continental Europe is facing the same kind of pressures that we are facing. But of course, one thing that is also different is the ways in which governments are responding. You see about half of European countries at the moment have some kind of price fixing or subsidies in place. We've seen France, for example, almost fix their energy prices. So in one sense, continental Europe is facing the same problems that we're facing, which is kind of wholesale gas prices are increasing. And they, of course, are also receiving a lot of their natural gas from Russia. But actually, the question is not kind of what's happening on the wholesale side, but what's happening on the consumer side. What we're seeing there is European countries in particular using their power, using the government budget to ensure that actually families can get through this winter that is yet to come.
But you mentioned France there, Jeevun. I mean, they've achieved that by nationalising EDF, which you didn't argue was what the government should be doing here. Is that right?
So you can nationalize kind of energy companies, but you'll still need to find a way to kind of pay the difference between what's your wholesale energy price as well as kind of what's coming out on the other side. If gas prices are just 5 times higher, if you were to nationalize, let's say, Centrica and British Gas, you still need to find a way to kind of make up the difference between gas prices as well as lower consumer prices. And also on the French side as well, EDF, of course, a much higher kind of nuclear energy mix there as well. So absolutely, look, there can be cases for it, but it's not the panacea, and it certainly won't be the kind of the thing that will get kind of immediate bills down.
Gemma, a final question in this section, which is very understandable. I find myself thinking it often. But why is it called a price cap if it keeps going up?
I know. I always find it very funny when we name things that absolutely do not mean what we say they do. I mean, the price cap was meant to be a cap on the. It's also a price cap on the unit of cost of a unit of energy as well. It's not even a cap on the total amount that you're going to be spending on your bills, and it is going up and up. And I think during the periods where we didn't see that much of an increase, during the periods where it would be reviewed once every 6 months and potentially not changed at all, it did its job. But absolutely, right now it's not a cap; it's increasing, and now, as I said, it's shortening it from every 6 months to every 3 months, and it's not providing consumers with any form of protection, because the cap, the limit that we're now talking about, again, for it to be the average of 2 months' salary to pay for your energy for 1 month is just absolutely untenable, and people are going to really struggle.
Gemma, Jeevun, as before, please stick with us. We're very much enjoying this discussion on the cost of living crisis, and coming up in the final segment, your outstanding questions ranging from if you're squeezed on private renting or what to do about childcare costs. Sky News Tonight back in a couple. Don't go nowhere.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
More flares going off, a volley of rocks, cobbles have been pulled up
out and are being used as missiles to hurl at these police. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. We have now left Italy and entered France. Nobody's asked to check our identity. Made by people who dare to challenge. Nice to see you again, Mr. Barnier. Why? Meeting you. Fishing does have the potential to stymie an enormous economic deal. What strikes you when you come to this glacier is not just the way in which the environment is changing, but the speed at which those changes are happening.
It's devastating, actually.
Welcome back to our cost of living crisis Q&A. Gemma and Jeevun still with us. A spread of miscellaneous questions to end the session with. And Gemma, first of all, renters are getting hit hardest with no prospect of owning a home. How can we help protect them?
Yeah, because we keep talking about how hard it is for people that are on variable rate mortgages, but really renters have been hit as well. So rents are up almost 10% versus last year. And stats now show that 1 in 5 of us are renting for up to 9 years before being able to afford our first home. And as Brits, we tend to love property. But some of the things that can be done to try and help are, of course, there are schemes like shared ownership, the lifetime ISA, where the government tops up a little bit up to a certain level. But, again, that's not really helping people whose wages have just not kept up with rising house prices. There's also the Help to Buy scheme, which enables people to have to afford a 5% deposit. But again, with interest rates going up as quickly as they are, they're also looking a little bit more dangerous for people, that are going to be struggling. So there's things in place to protect people from eviction. There's also obviously people that are relying on the bank of mum and dad, but most people don't have that privilege. And that's why, again, we're seeing a lot of people moving back home to try and save up as the only way to get onto the property ladder without spending the money on rent they would otherwise use in a deposit.
Related to that, Gemma, Aaron asks, I've signed a 12-month contract for a spare room with bills included. Can the landlord now charge for a rise in bills? I mean, how enshrined are those types of protections?
And actually another challenge that people are facing as well is that £400 payment that's due in October. If your landlord, rather than you, if your landlord's name is on the utility bill, they get the payment, and it's up to their goodwill as to whether they'll pass it on. So, there are lots of things that, you don't really have as much control over your destiny. I mean, in terms of advice for this question, it is about looking at the terms of a contract, because one thing to be aware of is no landlord can charge for a higher price than they're paying for your utility bills, but checking the terms to work out when they can actually implement an increase, because especially it is rare to be able to do it within a 12-month period unless it's articulated very clearly as a term in the contract.
Next one, Gemma. The cost of childcare is soaring and starting to outstrip affordable outgoings. Where can one find affordable childcare?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really tough word there is affordable, because, again, the price of childcare has shot up and far more, and it's outstripped people's wages as well. So, that is why people are seeing a huge demand for more flexible working, cutting out commute to work, being able to work around holidays, and also relying on family as well. But a couple of things just to focus on in terms of government support. There's something known as tax-free childcare, which is replacing childcare vouchers. And again, for every £8 you put into your childcare account, the government puts £2 in, up to a maximum of £2,000 per child per year. And also for 3 to 4 year olds, in addition to this, you can get between 15 to 30 hours of free childcare as well. And the thing to look at is, if you go to the government website, to set up a childcare account. Alternatively, for working families that qualify for universal credit, they can claim back up to 85% of their monthly childcare costs, again, up to a certain limit. That's a support in place. But absolutely, I mean, as a working mum as well, I do sympathise that, childcare is getting more and more expensive.
So we want to bring it back to the bigger picture now as we round off the hour. And Jeevun, we've got a hustings going on tonight between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And even though I know you would have liked to see action sooner, one of them will be in place as the new Prime Minister by the start of next month. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you'd like to see them do in order to ease this crisis that we've been discussing?
So first of all, freeze that energy price cap. Save families over £2,000 this winter. That will stop middle-class families going to the wall. The second thing is get more money into low-income families' pockets in particular, and bring back, of course, that universal credit uplift that is no longer in place. That £1,000, it will help stop children going hungry in this country as well. And finally, thirdly, make sure we don't end up in this situation again. Right, make sure we insulate every single home so we lower energy prices for the future. Make sure we're more dependent upon renewables that don't mean that we are kind of so subject to the whims of oil and gas that are supplied by murderous dictators. And the final thing I'd say is this. Both of them, both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, are talking about tax cuts. And the truth is their tax cuts will not help families at home. Liz Truss's tax cuts, like national insurance cut, only gives the average family about £110. It gives the top 5% around £2,000. Those tax cuts will do nothing to help families, or do very little to help families to get through what is, of course, a once-in-a-lifetime crisis.
Gemma, are there any relatively simple things that haven't been done yet that you think would help people?
Well, there needs to be much more financial support for hardworking families. And I absolutely agree with the initiatives that have been set out. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is the importance of speaking up as well, because, this is hitting everybody. It hits people that own a home or are renting. It hits people that have a car and that obviously are hit by petrol prices, but also the ones that are taking public transport to work. So whichever way you look at it, this is affecting people across the board. And it's so important to speak up. It is affecting, I think, people's mental health. And being able to speak to a bank to avoid falling into an unarranged overdraft, speaking to a mortgage provider to maybe get a mortgage holiday. And again, that could be between 1 to 12 months, or speaking to utility companies as well to try and get a payment plan that's more affordable. Those things could be available. And there are obviously lots of charities as well to speak to. And I think it's very, very important that we speak up.
And Jeevun, in terms of the outlook for the economy overall, I mean, clearly the monetary policy is being set by the Bank of England. The government itself can, to oversimplify things, think about either spending more or taxing less. And if we look at the proposals of the 2 candidates, one is leaning more towards one of those tactics, the other to the other. Which actually helps the economy more at a moment like this?
Spending more, because those on lower incomes will spend a high proportion of their income. If you do as what Liz Truss wants to do, give that kind of £2,000 tax cut to the top 5%, they're going to spend, or rather save, quite a lot of that money. And on the other side, of course, if you give that money to those on the lower half who are absolutely struggling, who can't even afford to put food on the table, they're going to spend that money to go and put food on the table. And the final thing I'd say is this: an economy is not some abstract, wild thing. It is a bunch of people, or rather a collection of people, that produce and consume. And if people are going hungry today, it makes them less productive at work today. And if children are going hungry today, it makes them less productive in the future. So our economy is the people fundamentally who live in this country.
Gemma, just finally, it's been very downbeat. I'm not sure we can end on an optimistic note, but maybe a slightly less pessimistic one, which is, you said earlier recession is now inevitable, but the prospect of it being quite a short one, not too severe a one, is that still within our control?
And we are seeing the Bank of England be quite aggressive in terms of trying to raise interest rates to try and handle it. I mean, we obviously saw a 0.5 percentage point increase, and again, there's rumours that that's what we're going to be seeing next time as well. So, there is a huge amount of focus on it. There's going to be a huge amount of pressure on the new Prime Minister as well to enact and enact quickly as well. And if we do so, again, this is something that, it has been a shock, but we now know what we're facing. We know what's needed in terms of more support to more vulnerable families. So we do have the ability to be able to do what's needed to try and help them grow out of it. But yes, I think it's, until that point, I think with the uncertainty, people are, it's a wait and see at the moment, and people, don't like that uncertainty, and we feel in a bit of a power vacuum at the moment.
Gemma, Jeevun, thank you both very much for joining us on this Q&A special. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.